6 weeks after his Moscow move, Modi arrives in Kyiv. Was the Prime Minister's mission in Ukraine just about geopolitical balancing, or does New Delhi now essay a more ambitious role in mediating in the Russia-Ukraine war? Hello and welcome to Worldview at the Hindu with me, Suhasini Haidar. We're going to take a look at some of those questions as this week Prime Minister Modi did what many saw as a major U-turn in Indian foreign policy, arriving in Kyiv for a visit that Western countries have been pressing him to do since the Russia-Ukraine war began in February 2022. Now, the visit was not just his first, it is the first time by an Indian Prime Minister to Ukraine since its independence in 1991. During a high-security visit that spanned just half a day, Prime Minister Modi met and embraced Ukrainian President Zelensky, much as he had Mr. Putin, and the two leaders spent several hours together, also visiting a memorial dedicated to children who have died in the conflict so far. In fact, my colleague, the Hindu's defense correspondent, Dinkar Peri, is in Kyiv, and he brought us more details. Listen in.
The talks, which were supposed to be for 30 minutes, went on for almost 2.5 hours, both the restricted and the combined formats. And end of it, as said by ex-FS Minister Jaishankar, it was a wide canvas. A lot of time in the discussion was spent discussing the current ongoing conflict. It was a bit of exchanging views and positions on how things are happening. President Zelensky gave an overview of situation on the ground, how things are panning out, how the situation is in the country here. And Prime Minister Modi also put out India's position. One issue was the Indian purchase of Russian oil. A short while back, Ukraine President did a press conference with the visiting media where he very candidly and repeatedly stated his concern, expressed his reservations and concerns over India's continued purchase of Russian oil, which he said is giving billions to Russia. Essentially now what he termed as a war economy now, funding, which goes to fund the war. So that's something, one of the biggest concerns he had expressed. So President Zelensky also expressed interest in expanding the bilateral cooperation, the trade, which he said he expects to go by 3 to 5 times in the near future, and they'll work towards that. India and Ukraine signed 4 agreements. One was on India's humanitarian assistance for specific programs, one on cultural cooperation, one on agriculture and food processing, and the 4th one on drugs and medicines. Essentially, the regulation, because Ukraine follows the European standards, so which India does not really, India has its own method of doing, regulating its medicines. So this agreement will actually cater to that, and as officials here indicated, this will actually facilitate Indian pharma exports to increase to this country, which even Ukraine is quite keen on, getting, because it's also cheaper and there's a huge, significant pharma industry. So that's one. And in the other thing, India has so far given about 16 tranches of humanitarian assistance, largely medicines and other small supplies to Ukraine. So in the latest, India has given something called a Bhishma, a field, a sort of a field, mobile field hospital, which can be packaged and moved and airdropped even if required, and it can be converted into an essential medical facility. It is weighing about 21 tons, which actually flew in a Indian Air Force C-17. So that was what was handed over today as well.
And of course, all eyes during the visit was on the bonhomie between the leaders, the optics and the outcomes, but also whether Prime Minister Modi's formulation of the war had changed at all. Of course, that he has consistently said there are no victors on the battlefield, that solutions to the Russia-Ukraine war must come from dialogue and diplomacy. In fact, he said that a day prior to the visit to Kyiv as well, in Poland, where he paid his respects at World War II memorials, including a square named after an Indian Maharaja who had sheltered 1,000 Polish children who were fleeing the World War. Listen in to what Prime Minister Modi and President Zelensky then said.
आज का दिवस भारत और यूक्रेन के संबंधों के लिए एक बहुत ही ऐतिहासिक दिवस है, क्योंकि भारत का प्रधानमंत्री आज पहली बार यूक्रेन की धरती पर आ रहा है। ये अपने आप में एक ऐतिहासिक घटना है। कल आपका नेशनल डे है। ये बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण दिवस है। मेरी तरफ से 140 करोड़ भारतीयों की तरफ से मैं आपके नेशनल डे पर अनेक अनेक शुभकामनाएं देता हूं और मैं कामना करता हूं शांति के लिए, सुख और समृद्धि के लिए।
First of all, a really very good meeting, and this historic one, and for us it's very important that the first Prime Minister from your very big country.
So just how big was the shift implied by Modi's Ukraine visit? Let's just take a look at how New Delhi approached the issues of the war so far. First, no criticism of Russia at the United Nations or otherwise, abstentions on all such votes. Second, the Prime Minister did not accept Ukraine's earlier request to participate in the G20 last year. India has not cut or trade or oil imports from Russia, as the West has been asking for. In fact, oil has increased multifold. Imports from Russia went from about 0.5% of India's total oil imports to 44%. Fourth, India had not so far accepted Ukraine's request to supply things like telecom, medical, construction equipment for help in reconstruction there. And finally, India has not been a part of any peace initiatives. It, in fact, disassociated itself from the June Swiss Peace Summit document, although an Indian delegation did attend. Question: why did Prime Minister Modi go to Kyiv at this point? Of course, one would be in order to preserve that balanced approach in the conflict on Ukraine after his visit to Moscow. Another would be that the visit will hopefully blunt the sharp criticism we saw coming from the US of the Moscow visit, and also, of course, the disappointment that President Zelensky had expressed of Prime Minister Modi's embrace of President Putin. Remember, the MEA has denied that the visit to Kyiv came under any pressure from the US or anyone else. A third reason, with the war progressing for 2.5 years now, Russia continuing to occupy Ukrainian territory, Ukraine has now opened a new front in the Russian oblast of Kursk. It seems to be clear for New Delhi that the best case scenario here on is a frozen conflict, not an outright win for either side or one where either side will really backtrack. Another reason could be that next month in September, Prime Minister Modi will be at the UN for the Summit of the Future, and it may have been felt that the visit to Kyiv was appropriate at this point if India wants to have its voice heard on tackling global conflicts. Another reason, while the government has maintained India's strategic autonomy, it has relations with every country in a different form, independent of each other, the fact is that India's perceived bias in favor of Russia in the war had begun to bleed into ties with other countries like Europe in particular, European countries in particular. So it's hoped that this will stem that. And finally, India does have a lot of important bilateral business with Ukraine as well for wheat, fertilizer, defense equipment, and others. So what should you watch out for in the next few months particularly? One is really any kind of reaction from Russia. Thus far, the Kremlin and Moscow have been very quiet on the Prime Minister's visit to Ukraine. The second is if there is any shift in India's position on the war. A third, whether India makes any efforts towards the peace process, particularly that second summit expected in November that President Zelensky has spoken about. A very key one to watch for is whether India now steps up supplies to Ukraine as per Kyiv's request, that's specifically for that equipment that I had spoken about. And the fifth, of course, is that Prime Minister Modi is set to visit Russia again to Kazan for the BRICS summit, and that will be very important to watch. So what's Worldview's take? By traveling to Kyiv at this time, Prime Minister Modi has attempted a tricky balance that was perhaps necessitated by his visit to Moscow in July. While personal travel, face-to-face summits have some importance, foreign policy is really built on much longer-term actions, patterns of actions by any country. And it remains to be seen whether New Delhi is shifting its position on Ukraine in a broader context as well. Remember, a balanced position on the war does not actually indicate a balance in ties or an equality in ties with Kyiv and Moscow, as India's ties with Russia are clearly far deeper and broader. Time for some Worldview reading recommendations now, and I have a few new books for you. One is called The Zelensky Effect. This is by Olga Unuk and Henry Hale. It's a very interesting profile of Zelensky. Another book called The War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict by Medea Benjamin and Nicola Davis. These are two activists. They're not analysts, but it's an interesting take, particularly on NATO and Russia. There's a book called Displaced Civilians in the Russia-Ukraine War. This is by Valerie Panyushkin. She looks at both sides of the war, and she's herself a Russian dissident and journalist. One called Russia-Ukraine War, The Conflict and Its Global Impact by Ajay Singh, a very interesting international view. A couple of books on Indian diplomacy, one called Beyond Strategic Autonomy by Rajendra Abhyankar, a former diplomat. And then one I've always really liked called India at the Global High Table, The Quest for Regional Primacy and Strategic Autonomy by Teresita Schaefer and Howard Schaefer. These are just general books, but you might enjoy them. And one specifically on Poland called The Second Homeland, Polish Refugees in India by Anuradha Bhattacharjee, who look at the work of the Maharaja and spoken about. But that's all we have time for here on Worldview. Do join us again from the team. Thanks for watching.